All right, so we're going to pick up to look at the end of our notes for Chapter 11, since we're not going to get a chance to do this in class. So I figured the next best thing would be to post this to the Schoology page. So Chapter 11, Section 5 deals with how we get new species to arise. And one of the major causes for this to occur is when some subpopulation of a larger population gets separated in one of a couple of ways. So if we no longer have genes flowing between these two populations, so there's no immigration or emigration for a couple of reasons we're going to talk about, those are what lead to these populations becoming isolated. As these populations become isolated, there may be different selective pressures from one population to the next, which might cause the gene pools to change. So we've got a different set of conditions that might favor some alleles over others in one population or subpopulation, and different alleles might be favored in a different one. So over time, as the populations evolve, we're going to get more and more differences between those two subpopulations. We can also have reproductive isolation occur, and that's when we have different populations that can no longer mate successfully for a number of reasons that we're going to look at in just a little bit. And then that ultimately can lead, all of those things can ultimately lead to the process of speciation, the creation of two or more species from the same existing species. So this little diagram over here, this shows a linear time on our y-axis. So we've got this population over here. For whatever reason, it splits either through geographic separation or reproductive isolation. They're no longer able to reproduce with each other. So along this path, we have certain conditions that cause certain genes to be selected for that are different than over on this side. So one of the ways that they can become isolated is through behavioral barriers, basically not a physical barrier, but there might be certain mating behaviors that differ from one group to the next. So for instance, if two members of the same species meet and the rituals that they go through for mating, so like if there's certain calls or dances or certain other triggers that would lead to two organisms mating, if one of them's not familiar with them or it doesn't have the same response as it should, that could isolate those species. So here we've got these blue-footed boobies, which I think we saw relatives of these in our Voyage to the Galapagos video. They undergo a very elaborate dance. The males put on quite a display for the affection of the females, and a lot of them get rejected. The display doesn't tick the boxes that the female has, and so he'll get rejected, and she'll wait for another suitor to put on a different display. We see these a lot with birds. So there's a number of bird species that go through very elaborate displays to varying successes. So we can also have geographic barriers. So things like a mountain range or a newly formed river that might divide a population of two or more groups. We see this in California. So California, there's a coastal mountain range here, and there's an inland mountain range here in the middle. We've got the Central Valley. Coincidentally, the Central Valley is where most of our produce comes from. Not sure why that keeps popping up, but oh well. So, like if you have lettuce, head of lettuce, or vegetables, fruits, most likely came from the valley. But along these mountains, there is a population of salamanders that live. In the north, there's just one population, but as we go down the western set of mountains, and we compare that to the eastern set of mountains, we have slight differences in those salamanders as we move further south. The further south we go, because the conditions in these mountains are very different from one another, the selective pressures for these salamanders are different from one another. So they become more and more different until at the very end of the valley we have two very distinct populations. So they're no longer able to interbreed with each other. If we took any of these, they're usually able to breed with the subspecies to the north and to the south of it. So this salamander here would be able to have offspring with the population up there, or with the southern one. This one could reproduce with this one and this one, but this one probably couldn't reproduce over here with this guy because there's mounting amounts of genetic differences. So we also have temporal barriers. Temporal meaning time. So when the timing of different reproductive events don't overlap, so we've got different mating seasons. So if we have some subset of a population that has a mating season that's later in the year than the other subset of the population, there could be enough time differences that we'd lose gene flow between those. So one example is with like the cicadas we're going to see this summer. So the mature cicadas only emerge from the ground every 17 years, live a really short life, once they're above ground as adults, and then mate and then die. The eggs that are laid that summer will hatch in the ground, and the cicada will live as a larva for about 17 years, only to reemerge. So there's not much gene flow between successive years. So they're kind of you can almost think of it as 17 distinct species. I don't know if anybody does think of it that way, but you can almost imagine it that way. This graph over here shows two species of frog that live together in very close proximity. They could even be in the same pond, but they've got different mating seasons. So one tends to start their mating season at towards the end of March, and the other tends to start their mating season towards the middle of May. And since there's not much overlap in the mating season, it prevents genes from flowing between these two species. All right. And then if we have a geographic separation or geographic isolation of two groups, we call that allopatric, or different homeland speciation. So this is when we have some sort of geographic barrier to gene flows, like the valley between the two mountain ridges. Another example here we'll look at actually the next slide. We also have reproductive isolation. So if there's no physical barrier, but a reproductive barrier, we still have two subsets of the population living in close proximity, so intermingled with one another. But because there are differences in their ability or timing of the reproduction, they're going to slowly differ over time. And we call this sympatric speciation. So when we have two subpopulations that are isolated in the same geographic area. So this diagram kind of compares the two. We're starting with this forest that's covered with certain species of trees. If an event occurs, a geologic event, we have a splitting or a rifting or a river cutting through the middle of this forest. If there's no gene flow between these two populations, there could be enough differences over time that we end up with two new species. That would be allopatric speciation. On the other situation, if we have no geographic, like a river or mountain forming between these two or within this population, but we have some sort of genetic variety among one or two of these that ultimately prevent it from reproducing with the surrounding ones, either through timing or maybe it's attracting a different pollinator than the surrounding ones. Over time, there could be enough genetic isolation that we form a new population, a new species, and that's sympatric speciation. So, as more and more people study evolution, as we look towards more in interactions and of species, we find that really it's the environment that controls natural selection. So you can almost think of natural selection being like the coach who's making the cuts. The environment's like the coach, and natural selection is you're trying to make the team. If you don't make the team, you die. That's unfortunate, but so it's not random in the sense that there's certain things that nature or the environment prefers. So if you're in the Arctic and you're trying to hide from predators, nature says you're going to be lighter colored, you're going to be more fit to survive. So if there's variety that provides dark fur, that's probably not going to be able to pass its genes on. So however, evolution is not directed, so there's not like some end game that evolution's trying to create. So there's not like an ultimate form that animals or plants are going to take. It's going to constantly occur. But since we live in an environment that contains animals and plants, we are actually part of the environment. So when things are evolving due to environmental changes, that evolution in and of itself is an environmental change, and that can affect the evolution of a different species. This is where we get the idea of convergent evolution. So to converge, two roads are converging, they're coming together. Convergent evolution is when two similar characteristics form an unrelated species. So think back to the last chapter when we looked at analogous structures, structures that perform the same function but are different in terms of their development. So like an insect's wing versus a bat's wing. They both allow it to fly, but they're completely different in their structure. We can also have this lead to divergent evolution. So diverge is to move away from. So this is where we have two closely related species that diverge in their evolution. So they might be isolated in different environments, and those different environments might select for different traits. So the examples we see here of convergent evolution is the tails of aquatic animals. So a dolphin, which is a mammal, has a very broad, flat tail, very similar to that of a shark, which is a fish. Not very evolutionarily closely related, but they have a very similar tool to meet the unique conditions of their environment. Here we have divergent evolution. We've got two species of fox. They have a common ancestor at some point in the past. With the red fox, because it lives in a different environment, it's going to be selected for different traits, whereas the kit fox is going to have traits that are better suited to its environment. So over time, those two species have diverged into new species. But we also have kind of like an arms race. Well, I guess in this example, claws race, but an arms race nonetheless. So the evolution of one species could drive the evolution of another species. So here we've got this example of a crab. This crab is a predator of snails. These snails have a protective shell, so the snails that have thicker shells are going to survive better. They're going to be better protected from these crabs. However, the crabs that have evolved stronger claws are going to be able to get through those thicker shells, which is going to further force the evolution of these snails to have thicker, more spiny shells, which is going to lead to the evolution of these crabs to have even bigger, more strong claws, and so on and so forth. So we see this a lot in nature. So another example here is the acacia tree. Acacia trees live in the prairies of Africa, or the savanna. So if you've seen footage of the savanna, you might see a lone tree here or there. I was thinking of the Lion King. Those are usually acacia trees. And these acacia trees, they might be the only vegetation of any substance in many kilometers. So they're easy pickings for things that might want to eat them. However, some of them evolved a relationship with this ant, and this ant will fiercely protect the acacia tree because the acacia tree is its home. The acacia tree grows these spikes, and these spikes have holes in them that are hollowed out, and it provides a place for these ants to live. I think also produces some nectar for these ants to eat and survive off of. What the acacia tree gets in return is anytime something decides that it wants to eat some of this acacia tree or brush up against the acacia tree, these ants will come out in force and bite or sting the predators that are trying to eat the acacia tree. So the acacia tree has evolved in this way to make it a hospitable place for these ants, and these ants have evolved a way to defend their homes. So it's kind of a neat thing that nature has done. And another thing that can happen over time is species can become extinct. And extinction, I think we're all familiar with it. It's just when there's no more of a particular species. It's gone forever. About 98 or so percent of all species that have ever lived on Earth have gone extinct. And in our geologic history, we have evidence for 5 different extinction events. And this usually occurs when a species as a whole is unable to adapt to changes. So very rapid changes in the environment can lead to extinction. So what we see about 65 million years ago, the end of the dinosaurs. And it's posited that we're pretty sure that it was caused by an asteroid impact or a comet impact that led to blocking out of the sun and plunged the Earth in a very cold environment, which was not very good for the dinosaurs. Luckily for us, we are the product of what was left over. Going back in history, we see some other extinction events in the past. Many claim that we're currently involved in a 6th extinction caused by us, in our demand for resources. So anytime there's a change in the environment, or if we have a new predator, or if we have a new food supply, or if we have decreased food supply, those are all examples of changes that can lead to extinction. Now, if these changes occur more gradually or slower, it can lead to adaptations that would allow those species to adapt to that new environment. But if the evolution, or if the change occurs too quickly, like a meteor impact, it could be very hard for species to adapt. We can also look at the rate at which speciation occurs. Now, there's kind of two schools of thought. One is what we call punctuated equilibrium, where we've got very quick bursts of activity followed by long periods of stability. So, this is the relatives of modern day horses. They've evolved to be bigger, different type body plan, and we see evidence in the fossil record that they remained a very similar, very same form for tens of thousands of years, if not more, hundreds of thousands of years. And then very quickly in the fossil record, we see a somewhat rapid change. So this lends credence to the idea that we have little minor disruptions in the environment that open up new opportunities for species to evolve. But there's some schools of thought so that this is just a slow, gradual change over time. You're not going to see as much drastic change as you would in punctuated equilibrium. And that's the idea of gradualism. So speciation occurs at a relatively regular, gradual rate. And then the last thing we're going to talk about is adaptive radiation. So when something's radiating, it's moving away from the center, and what we're looking at here is the center being like the ancestral species, and then the radiation is moving away from that in a number of different body plans. So when we looked at the finches on the Galapagos, they're all descended from one mainland type finch that found its way out there. When those finches began to settle the Galapagos, there were all these unrealized niches, unrealized opportunities for some of them. So some went to eat fruit as opposed to seeds, some ate vegetation, some went to eating insects. And so that's what we see here. We see this adaptive radiation, a spreading out, or a change in a number of different branches of one species branching off into many different species. So, and this occurs relatively rapidly, and we usually see this on islands that are either uninhabited or quickly inhabited by a new species. And that is it for the notes.